Viewers like you make this program possible. Support your local PBS station.
Every day, history is traded all over the world. Poignant, bizarre, and unique items that may never have been seen in public before. A fascinating and often untold tale lies behind every object.
It looks pretty gruesome, but actually the reality behind it is probably far more gruesome than the object itself.
This may be our last chance to see them before they disappear forever into private collections. Our quest? To unearth extraordinary objects drawn from every corner of the world and reveal the amazing hidden histories behind them.
My father was shot down by this man at Schnaufer. His plane is right at the top. The 29th of June, 1943.
On this episode of Trading History, the untold story of one prisoner of war's brave involvement in the Great Escape.
He was waiting in the safety of the trees when he saw a German guard. He raised his arms and shouted, "Don't shoot, don't shoot."
And his watch that has survived to this day. The spectacular rise and fall of one of the greatest cyclists the world has ever known.
It was really Tom Simpson that put the sport on the map way back in the 1960s.
And could this unusual photo frame be a rare piece of Russian Faberge?
There are about 50 of these remarkable objects.
When I saw that mark, I thought, if that's what I think it is, that's incredible.
In 1944, an escape plan by Allied prisoners of war proved so audacious that it found its way onto the silver screen.
To build 3 tunnels at the same time was unprecedented and actually is one of the things that marks the Great Escape as a special event.
The story of the Great Escape from the Stalag Luft III Nazi prison camp was immortalized in the classic film of the same name, starring Steve McQueen as the iconic motorbike-riding Captain Hiltz, nicknamed the Cooler King. Now, a Rolex watch, thought to have been worn by one of the British prisoners of war involved in the real-life Great Escape, is up for sale. It's being auctioned off by the family of Flight Lieutenant Lawrence Revel Carter and is one of thousands of watches given by Rolex to air crewmen during the Second World War.
The RAF prisoners of war had all their watches and so forth confiscated by the guards, and Rolex very kindly offered a replacement on the basis they could pay for these after the war, partly as propaganda and partly as marketing.
A typed message accompanying the Rolex Oyster Speed King confirms it was ordered by Revel Carter on the 4th of August 1942, by which time the airman was a prisoner of war. But what makes this watch special above all others is the story behind it. In 1936, Lawrence Revel Carter made his name as an Olympic discus thrower, coming second at the Berlin Games. 4 years later, and a flight lieutenant in the RAF, he was shot down over northern Germany and taken prisoner. It was a year into the Second World War. Hitler had invaded Poland and was preparing to occupy France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. By 1942, the German Luftwaffe were constructing Stalag Luft III for captured Allied Air Force servicemen, a virtually escape-proof prisoner of war camp deep behind enemy lines.
The Luftwaffe chose to locate many of its camps in the eastern districts of Germany to make escape more difficult. Pilots, after all, were almost the most valuable enemy prisoners you could get. They were expensive to train, it took a long time, they were valuable people, and you wanted to prevent them from escaping back to enemy lines and joining the fight again.
The 60-acre camp was home to thousands of British and US prisoners of war, including Revel Carter. Life for the airmen was relatively comfortable.
They had a fully functioning theatre, they staged musicals, theatre play, they received feature films from America and Great Britain, they had a debating society, they had a virtual university in the camp where people could take classes and get degrees. There was a lot of sport going on. So it's a virtual town, it's a little community which had a lot to offer. And not every prisoner of war who was part of this community was interested in leaving it.
Lawrence Revel Carter, though, was not one of them. And he, like many of the airmen, were constantly hatching escape plans.
In June 1943, Revel Carter discovered a way of how it would be possible to leave the camp, because there was a regular cart going with waste paper from the camp, and his idea was that a prisoner could hide in one of the sacks filled with waste paper and thereby slip through the main gate. The escape committee reviewed his proposal, but decided that he was too big to actually hide in one of the sacks. So it was decided that two smaller prisoners, one American and one from New Zealand, would take his place, and they actually managed successfully to slip through the gate, cut themselves out of the sacks, and then ran off into the woods.
Unfortunately, within a short time the two were recaptured and sent back to Stalag Luft 3. With the chance of a successful breakout from the Sargen camp remote, all escape operations were aimed at diverting enemy resources away from the war effort. To achieve maximum disruption, preparation was everything.
In Stalag Luft 3 you had escape committees. People were responsible for different kind of escapes, either under the wire, through the wire or over the wire. And you had people who were specialized in forging papers, in forging clothing, civilian clothing, people who produced maps. So it was an increasingly professional enterprise.
In 1943, the Escape Committee drew up plans for one of the most audacious prison breaks of the Second World War. Their aim? To get hundreds of men out in one go, among them Flight Lieutenant Revel Carter. By then, he'd received this letter from Rolex in February, confirming they were sending him this watch at a cost of 80 Swiss francs. By 1944, plans for the Great Escape had reached new heights.
There were certain new features about the Great Escape. One was the sheer scale, to build 3 tunnels at the same time, especially since the tunnels were so deep and so complicated to construct. That was unprecedented. The second new feature was the amount of people they wanted to get out. They were aiming to get 200 prisoners of war out of Stalag Luft 3 at one go, which no one had ever tried before. The escape committee was pretty clear that very few of those who were going through the tunnel into freedom would actually reach Allied territory. But by trying to get as many people out as possible, they were hoping to divert the Germans from fighting the war. They had to find timber to shore up the tunnel and to prevent it from collapsing. They used timber from their bunk beds, they used timber from the theater seats, and to build a ventilation system that supplied enough air for the people who dug the tunnel was a feat of remarkable ingenuity. So the tunnel in itself as a piece of engineering is breathtakingly sophisticated, one has to say.
Finally, as night fell on the 24th of March 1944, the signal was given to go. Around 10 p.m, the first of the escapees emerged from the tunnel. They only had a few hours to get all 200 men out. But there was a problem. The tunnel fell 10 feet short of the tree cover beyond the perimeter fence. It slowed the Great Escape down and was to be its undoing. By 5 a.m, time was running out. Less than half the men had reached the trees. Disguised as a Hungarian worker, Revel Carter was the 76th man through the tunnel when calamity struck.
He was waiting in the safety of the trees when he saw a German guard coming close, discovering the tunnel entrance and raising his rifle ready to shoot. So rather than going away, trying to escape just in time, he came out of hiding, raised his arms into the air, waving them, and shouted, don't shoot," in German, thereby distracting the guard and probably saving the guy who was just about to come out of the tunnel, saving this person's life. After the war, he got an OBE in recognition of this brave deed.
Of those who escaped, only 3 made it home to Britain, and of those recaptured, 50 were shot by the SS. Flight Lieutenant Lawrence Revel Carter survived the war and went on to compete in the 1948 London Olympics. Now this great escapee's Rolex watch is up for sale.
Lot 708 is the Great Escape watch belonging to Flight Lieutenant Revel Carter with the documentation. Any more from the room? We're going to sell it on the maiden bid. All done and finished, going once, going twice. Sold.
The watch was sold to a private collector, but unlike many Rolex watches of the period, this one has that all-important provenance.
Because we know the story and have the object, the combination of the two actually makes the object valuable to us.
The tale of the Great Escape at Stalag Luft 3 and the Allied prisoners of war who daily risked their lives to thwart the enemy lives on in simple objects like this watch. Now it has a new owner. It's become part of the story that is trading history. France. Since 1903, it's been home to the Tour de France, the world's biggest cycle race, taking place over 23 days and more than 2,000 miles. In 2012, 7 times Tour de France winner Lance Armstrong was found guilty of taking a cocktail of banned substances to improve his performance. It rocked the sport to its very foundations. But this wasn't the first time cycling had been thrown into disrepute. In 1962, Tommy Simpson made history by becoming the first British cyclist to wear the famous yellow jersey.
It was really Tom Simpson that put the sport on the map way back in the 1960s.
What it took for Simpson to rise to the top was that he was very driven, very determined, had a great self-belief, allied to a lot of talent.
But behind the success lay a darker tale of drug abuse, which only came to light in 1967 when tragedy struck. Simpson collapsed and died as he ascended this mountain, Mont Ventoux. He was just 29 years old. Now, items belonging to Simpson himself are up for sale.
These were actually Tommy Simpson's race-worn jerseys. They've got his DNA on them. There we go, lot 40, an important cycling archive.
They're being sold by the son and daughter of David Cooper, a Liverpudlian friend of Simpson's. Since David died, the items have been boxed up in the attic. Along with the jerseys, there's a scrapbook and badges. So famous was Simpson that proving the item's provenance is key to selling them.
Now, we know that this has come from Tommy Simpson's best friend, and also the items are clearly of age. I mean, look at this one. We've got moth holes in it. The other thing that we know is that we've got a letter. For example, here's a letter here sent from Tommy Simpson, 10th of November 1959, from France, to his mate Dave in Liverpool. I will be coming over to Liverpool to see you. I will bring over with me several articles for your collection, jerseys, pennants and such. So that sort of thing really reinforces the genuine nature of the consignment.
Born in a mining village in County Durham just before the Second World War, Tommy took up road cycling aged 13. Within 6 years, he'd switched to pursuit racing, and at the age of just 19, won a bronze medal at the 1956 Melbourne Olympics as part of the British cycling team. Within 4 years, Simpson had moved into the big league. Partly driven by fame and money, he turned his back on British amateur cycling and looked to Europe to build his glittering career.
On the continent, it was professional, it was commercial, and it was based around stage races like the Tour de France, which was established in 1903, and the Giro d'Italia, which was established in 1909. So there were distinct differences in the culture of cycling between Britain and Europe.
By 1965, Simpson was an international star who had put cycling on the map.
And in many ways, that was Tommy Simpson's main achievement. He brought cycling into the mainstream of British popular culture, especially with his victory in the 1965 World Championship at San Sebastian. He was televised live by the BBC, and so it brought him and cycling to a national audience.
Back home, Tommy was amassing important sponsors, as his collection of racing jerseys shows.
The famous one of his sponsors we've got here, the Raphael Geminiani shirt there, and we've got the little button-up sections along the back, presumably for water bottles, I guess. We've got various other jerseys. They're all really cool. This one is his England World Championship jersey there. This one here, and that's the Bianchi Pirelli. And I'm sure there's going to be a certain type of collector that are going to be really pleased that it's dirty, it's not washed, bit sweaty, bit musty.
But Simpson's success came at a price.
Was Tommy Simpson a drugs cheat? Well, it'd be more surprising if he didn't take drugs, because of the doping culture within cycling and because of the demands of the sport. Not only were they covering great distances, but there was great demands on professional cyclists generally.
Doping in sport was nothing new. In ancient Greece, nutritional substances were used to enhance the physical performance of early Olympic athletes.
Cyclists in the 19th century, they used a number of performance-enhancing substances. Alcohol was a stimulant, and other substances such as strychnine. So the relationship between drugs and cycling was long-standing.
By 1920, the pharmaceutical companies were manufacturing vast quantities of amphetamines. The drug helped users stay awake for long periods of time and had been used by American soldiers during the Second World War. Now, it had found its way into sport. For many cyclists, winning the Tour de France is one of their greatest goals. In 1967, Tommy Simpson took on the 3,500-kilometre race again. This time, though, the cards were stacked against him.
That year, Simpson was looking for a lucrative contract with an Italian team. Finishing high up in the Tour de France general classification would have improved that contract. Secondly, he'd fallen ill earlier in the Tour, and members of his team had asked him or tried to persuade him to pack in the Tour. But because of the individual he was, because he was so driven and determined, and of course he had this commercial consideration hanging over him, then he wanted to carry on.
It was the 13th of July and the 13th stage of the race, a day that was to prove unlucky for Simpson. The route was over Mont Ventoux, a giant 1,900-metre-high mountain in the Provence region of southern France. It was also blisteringly hot. Earlier, Simpson had taken some brandy to overcome a feeling of sickness. Less than a kilometre from the summit, he collapsed. He died that afternoon in an Avignon hospital. An autopsy later found traces of alcohol and amphetamines in Simpson's blood. While the cause of death was given as a heart attack brought on by heat exhaustion, this cocktail of factors proved fatal on the day.
He was very hot, he'd been ill before. In those days, riders didn't rehydrate like they do today, didn't actually drink that much water. So certainly you could argue that the amphetamines were a contributory factor, but there were other factors as well to take into account.
And Simpson's legacy? In 1967, doping in cycling was rife, but his untimely death helped contribute to the introduction of mandatory drugs testing. Now, nearly 50 years on, he's best remembered for his sporting prowess.
In increasingly his legacy is more about his achievements as a cyclist rather than as a cyclist who was associated with doping.
There we go, lot 40. Loads of people interested. Let's get straight on with the bidding.
At the auction house, Tommy Simpson's racing jerseys, scrapbook and other memorabilia are about to go up for sale.
Are we all done now? We're selling to the phone bidder now.
They've been bought by a private collector who will be displaying them in a cycling museum for all to appreciate. Simpson's memory also continues to live on in this memorial, erected on Mont Ventoux, where the great cyclist collapsed on that day in 1967. This small silver cigarette case may look like an ordinary piece of smoking ephemera from the early 1900s, but there are marks on it which point to a darker story.
It says, from the Empress Maria and the Imperial family of Russia, on board HMS Marlborough, April 1919.
So could this be a significant artifact from the final days of Russian imperialism?
It holds a story that's probably more important than something that Tolstoy wrote about Russia.
But is it genuine? And if so, what is the story behind it? The end of the Great War in 1918 left 15 million dead and a world fractured by economic and political unrest. In America, President Woodrow Wilson championed Western democracy. In the East, Russia was in turmoil. The old imperial order served by the Romanovs was being dismantled in the face of revolution. By the time this cigarette case had been inscribed with the date 1919, the Russian Emperor Tsar Nicholas II had been executed by the communists on Lenin's orders. Art dealer Tim Hogarth is convinced the key to unlocking the story behind this artifact lies in the inscription. From the Empress Marie, the Grand Duke Nicholas and the Imperial family of Russia on board HMS Marlborough, April 1919. The Empress Marie was not only the mother of the executed Tsar Nicholas, but King George V's aunt. This link to Britain's royal family was significant at a time when Marie's own life in Russia would have been in danger.
The Dowager Empress of Britain, Alexandra, was also sister to the Dowager Empress of Russia. So you can imagine she was especially keen to get her sister out.
Under pressure from his mother, King George V sent a rescue mission. He'd already failed to save his cousin Tsar Nicholas for fear of revolution at home, but now he swiftly dispatched the battleship HMS Marlborough. This would explain why the inscription on the cigarette case refers to the ship by name. But who did the item belong to, and what was their link to the rescue mission? The clue could be in the name W. Marks, also etched on the case.
Who was Marks? Was he a crew member? Was he a valet? Was he, a servant that was sent out to help them? Hopefully, we'll find out.
Tim turns to the internet to track down the names of soldiers and sailors who served in the British Navy in 1919.
There are 105 results.
Without a Christian name, it's proving very difficult to find him.
You've got a Chief Petty Officer on board. Is that our guy? We've got a gunner there, somebody in the Royal Field Artillery. There's a possibility that it could be one of those, but it's literally, there are so many W marks, it's like looking for a needle in a haystack.
Tim turns to Russian historian John Russell for help.
I have got a fantastic piece of history to show you.
They've come to the Cliff Castle Museum in West Yorkshire and head up to the Grand Drawing Room, now the home of a Russian malachite fire surround, a rare remnant from 1840s imperialism.
So I've got it wrapped up in this. There it is.
Ah, beautiful.
This is the inscription, W. Marks.
Bearing in mind that there were 1,000 crew on the HMS Marlborough, my feeling is that this W. Marks might well have been a room steward or an able seaman.
On the 7th of April 1919, after travelling across the Black Sea, HMS Marlborough arrived in Yalta in the Crimea and prepared to set sail with the remaining Russian royal family, nobility and their servants. Alongside the 72-year-old Empress Marie was the Grand Duke Nicholas, former commander-in-chief of the Russian army. And Prince Felix Yusupov, the man reputed to have murdered the faith healer, Rasputin. Their departure was marked by an extraordinary moment in history. 170 Russian soldiers on a nearby boat sang the Russian Imperial anthem to the departing Empress Marie.
This was the very last time the Russian Imperial anthem was played to a ruling member of the Romanov family. So it really was the end of an empire.
The imperialists had lived an opulent life in their homeland, but now this was reduced to suitcases, crammed with as many precious jewels and treasures as they could carry. Could this cigarette case have been among the precious possessions they took with them?
They're fleeing their homeland. What sort of possessions would the imperial family have taken with them?
The Romanov family were famous for their necklaces of beads and diamonds, etc. And yet this very, very modest piece is one of the few items that have come up recently from that particular voyage.
But if the object did belong to Empress Marie, and was smuggled out of Russia on HMS Marlborough, how does John explain another intriguing feature?
You look here, that's the English hallmark there.
Right.
It's the lion hallmark, confirming it is British silver.
The Romanov family did settle, many of them did settle in England. It is quite possible that one of the retinue or one of the family itself did actually keep in contact with somebody they met on the boat. It was probably ordered and inscribed after the voyage.
The pieces of this captivating jigsaw puzzle are coming together. It's likely W. Marks was a British naval crewman working on HMS Marlborough on that historic rescue mission in 1919. And it may have been a gift to him from the Empress Marie while they were on board the ship. After just over a week at sea, HMS Marlborough successfully completed her mission, arriving in safe European waters in Malta on the 20th of April, 1919. The British sailors had rescued Empress Marie and her relatives from the clutches of the Red Army. A cigarette case may be out of fashion today, but this inscribed silver object has great historical significance. It remains a poignant reminder of a critical turning point in Russian history.
I think it's wonderful, and I'll be fascinated to know the exact full story of this item and where it goes from here.
It intrigued me, it whetted my appetite to find out a little bit more, and that was the reason that I bought it.
What started as a speculative buy at an auction has turned out to be a valuable piece of Anglo-Russian history.
The big thing that anybody wants in antiques is the word is provenance. What a provenance this little case has. So it's a really, really exciting discovery to put all the pieces together.
Tim continues to research the piece in the hope that one day more of this compelling story will come to light and he can establish its full provenance once and for all. Massachusetts, USA, a state that was at the forefront of one of the most significant moments in American history. In the 1770s, the people of Massachusetts rose up in defiance against their British colonial rulers. It was the spark that lit the fuse of the American Revolution. Now, a rare antique Massachusetts coin, which forms part of that explosive story, has come to light in a British auction house.
This is a wonderful example of the pine tree shilling, and it was a way and a means to get round British authority control.
This extremely rare coin was surprisingly unearthed more than 3,000 miles away from its place of origin, in a rural town in the south of England. It's now up for sale on the international market.
The coin is important for Americans partly because it is such a rare thing, and it obviously shows that colonists were not prepared always to follow royal procedure and English law.
With its distinctive image of a pine tree, it was produced in Massachusetts over 360 years ago, at a time when the New England state was ruled over by the British Empire. It's one of the earliest examples of American coinage.
We have around the edges of the coin, and it's actually rather well done. We've got New England, and then we have a beaded inner circle, and within that circle, the date 1652, and below the date, it actually has the amount on it, X and 2 1s, stating that it is a shilling, and it was a shilling made in New England. They produced their own coinage to get round British authority control at a time when there was not a lot of coinage in production.
Like the Spanish in the 17th century, the British were keen to establish colonies in America and targeted their resources at New England. The British colony in Massachusetts was founded in 1629, 9 years after the Plymouth Pilgrims left from England on the Mayflower. The settlers got a charter from the king to trade and formed the Boston-based Massachusetts Bay Company. Its job was to develop the colony and send valuable resources like lumber back to the mother country.
It was a costly enterprise to begin that process, and usually required backing from the Crown. Other kinds of financial backing could be a joint stock company, as Massachusetts Bay Company was. And that would help fund the ships, and obviously you would need to recruit people who were willing to make the journey, who were willing to settle, and that would be the sort of founding for it.
11 ships carrying 700 settlers, 240 cows and 60 horses are reported to have left from British shores for a new life. Many seeking their fortune, others escaping religious intolerance at home. But the journey west was fraught with danger.
Would have taken 8 to 12 weeks to make the voyage from England, and often you would have been down in the hold with limited food and water, often people getting sick. So it was a difficult journey already, and then when you arrived, of course, you're arriving to build a new place, negotiating with the natives who were there, and obviously having to plant crops, having to do all the work to build houses and churches and so on. Definitely not an easy option. There were a lot of perils, both of shipwrecks, of wars with natives, of disease, all of those things. So it was a difficult choice.
Today, Boston is a thriving city of over 650,000. Even in the 1640s, its appeal was such that some 20,000 British settlers had arrived. The jurisdiction over them lay with the English monarch, Charles I, and that stifled the colony's growth.
The normal factor of a colony is that you purchased all the end results, all the finished goods from the mother country. Every colonial nation took the raw goods from the colonies, produced the end result, and then sold it back to the colonies. And therefore there was quite a big profit involved. It also meant that the government could put taxes on them. The Americanists wanted to trade with the French, the Dutch, the Spanish, and you needed coins to do that.
British coins at this time bore the head of the king on one side, and they were all produced in England. So the colony's ability to trade was under the complete control of the British monarch.
There was a real lack of silver, and it was very difficult for colonists to trade and to develop the economy because of this lack of coinage and currency.
Back in England, the country was gripped by civil war. Charles I had been executed, and the parliamentarians were in control. It was then that the Massachusetts settlers took matters into their own hands.
Royal assent was required to set up a mint to produce coins, and in the period of 1652 there was no king because Charles I had been executed in 1649. So the colonists were able to set up a mint without royal authority.
And this was a way to continue commerce, and this particular coin, the pine tree shilling, is hand struck, and it was the first silver coin made in New England.
The mint produced a variety of coins from shillings to threepences. All had tree motifs, like the willow and oak, as it made them difficult to counterfeit. The pine tree, which features on this coin now up for sale, had particular meaning for the people of Massachusetts.
There were multiple aspects as to why the pine tree was likely chosen. First of all, lumber was an export, and pine trees and large trees were associated with the Americas. In fact, the seal of the Massachusetts Bay Company from 1629 shows an Indian in front of two pine trees.
In 1660, Charles II became king, and once more, royal approval was needed to mint coins.
Once the British found out that the colonists were making these coins, they put a stop to it. The colonists, being very clever, one could somewhat say they were a little bit devious, said, fine, we'll stop producing any more coins. But they did. They actually produced the same coin, the same date.
By keeping the same date of 1652 on any new coins produced, they were able to fool the British authorities for another 30 years before it was discovered. The behaviour of the Massachusetts settlers, though, was seen as an act of defiance which was to herald trouble more than a century later.
This coin shows something distinctive about Massachusetts in its history, New England in its history, a kind of anti-authoritarianism against the crown that's there, obviously, in the 17th century, that, of course, also becomes highly important in the 18th century when this same area is where the American Revolution begins.
The pine tree shilling was sold here in England to a private collector. And while the coin is an extraordinarily rare piece of American history, it's the meaning behind it that's proved more powerful.
These kinds of things like the pine tree are very symbolic. They continue to be symbolic during the American Revolution when the symbol of the Liberty Tree is taken as a revolutionary symbol, when effigies are burned at the Liberty Tree as a form of protest against English policy.
How this coin came to be buried in the ground in England is a mystery. But now this important piece of the story of America is part of trading history. Faberge is arguably the most iconic brand to come out of Russia. Internationally famous for their jewel-encrusted eggs, they also produced many other exquisite pieces that, through trade, have found themselves scattered over the four corners of the globe, attracting royalty, nobility, tycoons and industrialists from Paris to London, and America to the Far East. This next item could turn out to be a particularly rare example, if it proves to be genuine.
These are silent witnesses. They have a story, and it's our job to try and make them speak to you, to elucidate their past. Sometimes you can do it precisely, and sometimes you can't. Perhaps when you can't, it's even more mysterious.
St. Petersburg, Russia, home to the legendary 19th century jewellery firm, Faberge.
It was a huge business organisation. It was arguably the biggest goldsmiths business that's ever been. And it attracted patronage from the Imperial family, from all the descendants of Queen Victoria, royal heads throughout Europe and as far away as Siam.
Faberge made a variety of gold and silver gilt objects, but were best known for creating elaborate jewel-encrusted imperial Easter eggs for the Russian Tsars. Now in Britain, auctioneer Catherine Southern has unearthed this bejewelled nephrite jade picture frame in a box marked Faberge.
I have never handled a piece of Faberge. This sort of thing just doesn't come about.
But is it a genuine antique from the great Russian jewelers themselves? Founded in 1842 in Russia's second largest city, Faberge's world reputation as great artistic jewelers grew from its status as the official goldsmith to the Russian royal family. The company's artistic vision was in the hands of Peter Carl Faberge. Its reputation for exquisite craftsmanship was assured in its most enduring creations. The Imperial eggs, commissioned by the Tsars as presents for their consorts at Easter.
The tradition of the Faberge Easter egg started in 1885. Tsar Alexander III of Russia was the first, and every year he gave an egg made by Faberge to his wife. When he died, Nicholas II took up this pattern, and there are about 50 of these remarkable objects. People think of Faberge as the manufacturer of the Imperial Easter eggs, and that's that. But there was a huge and enormously varied stock.
Now one of those Faberge items has turned up here, in Surrey.
During one of our quite standard valuation days, the lady who bought this along was more concerned with taking up too much of my time. When she opened up the box and produced this, and I told her it was Faberge, she was absolutely gobsmacked.
The early 20th century picture frame belonged to the owner's grandfather. But how this luxury Russian-crafted object found its way to a home in Britain is a mystery.
The only thing we can be virtually certain of is the capability of the person to actually afford it at Faberge. It was not a cheap date to go into Faberge. The things were very costly indeed. Perhaps that's really the only certainty that we have, that the person that bought it could afford it and could afford to give it away.
Authentic Faberge items are highly sought after and worth hundreds of thousands of pounds. Catherine believes the Russian name on this box and the ornate style of the picture frame suggests it's genuine, but she can't be absolutely sure. She's asked her colleague, antiques dealer Aubrey Dawson, for a second opinion.
Now, if you look at it from that box, that doesn't actually tell you a huge amount, does it? You look at it and you just think that could be a set of spoons.
It's very
or
plain
it could
and
be...
unassuming, isn't it?
Exactly. And then when I opened it up, I just thought, that is beautiful. And then when I saw that mark, I thought, if that's what I think it is, that's incredible.
It is very difficult. You look at it and you do a double take and you think, is this right? Because there's a lot of fakes around as well.
It's been handed down through the family, generations, and nobody's really taken any notice of it. No.
And unless you understand Russian, you're not going to know what the make is.
And I think people are very worried whether it is the right thing.
Finding a piece that could be by the famous jewellery firm always attracts interest, particularly if it's new to the market. One man, dealer Adam Lippett, has come to take a closer look.
And I know you're concerned because you said there's so many fakes on the market.
Well, but I think most people have been stung with these things. Yeah, it's very nice. That's always a telltale thing.
What's that?
If you run your finger against these, are they sharp?
Rough or not?
Yeah, they're a bit sharp. I think there's a difference in quality between the stand and the actual piece. Where's the maker's name? Is it here?
It's marked in 3 places.
Who did you say it was made by?
Mikhail Perkin.
Mikhail Perkin's name could be the clue to the frame's authenticity.
It's very faint, it's quite rubbed, isn't it? I'm just not sure.
Catherine has sought advice from Wartskis, renowned specialists in Faberge artworks. For managing director and Faberge expert Geoffrey Munn, everything about this frame points to it being genuine.
The interesting thing about the picture frame is that it was made in the same workshops as some of the Imperial Easter eggs, because it's signed with the workmaster initials of Michael Perkin, who was chief workmaster. He was above all the other workshops.
While Carl Faberge ran the company, it was master craftsmen like Mikhail Perkin who oversaw the making of the firm's decorative objects.
It's everything you'd expect from him: lapidary work, gem set work, colours of gold in the original box. And so, yes, it's immediately recognisable as a Faberge object.
The picture frame dates anywhere from 1903 to 1917, the start of the Russian Revolution. Civil unrest, food shortages, and open revolt against the Imperial government sounded a death knell for the Romanovs and the end of the world-famous goldsmiths. The firm was nationalized by the Bolsheviks, a revolutionary party led by Lenin, keen to see the end of capitalism. It forced Carl Faberge to flee the country, dying in Switzerland 2 years later. Back in Surrey, the now authenticated picture frame is about to be auctioned.
We are on lot 183, which is our gold-mounted nephrite photo frame marked Faberge with a mark of Mikhail Perkin. We have interest here.
In the room is dealer Adam Lippett, who had initial doubts about its provenance.
No, I'm just not sure. Do you want me to be absolutely honest?
Now he's had a change of heart and is keen to own this piece of Russian history. But he's up against other bidders.
It's on the phone, it's against you now. Any more? All done then. Selling then.
4:30.
Thank you, sir.
Finally, Adam wins the day.
I initially had concerns over it when I first saw it, but I did some more research and those were allayed, and I think it's a very good piece. And I've bought it initially for my private collection. I should do some cleaning work and so on it, and then in due course, when I've finished appreciating it, it will be available on the market.
For decades, this exquisite piece of Faberge lay undiscovered in a private home hundreds of miles from its place of origin. Now, it's begun a new journey. Will it end up back here in St. Petersburg? No one knows. But this is all part of the mystery behind trading history.